Thank you, Kevin. Good day, everyone. My name is Gordon Stanger. For those who don't know me, I'm an earth scientist with a long-standing interest in clarifying misconceptions within the Bible. For those who do know me, you may notice that I've looked at many of the Old Testament miracles and perhaps a few of the New Testament miracles also in previous discussions. And concluded that many of these, in fact, the great majority of them, have rational or naturalistic explanations as to how they occurred. And I have attempted to point out that God's hand in such miracles was clearly evident through such aspects as impeccable timing, wildly improbable natural events, consistency with prayer, and with the direction of God's unfolding plan and foreknowledge and such like. Some examples include the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, at least 9 and possibly all 10 of the plagues of Egypt, Moses leading Israel over the Reed Sea, Yam Suf, being led by the pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night, Israel led by the ark crossing the river Jordan in flood, the battle of Jericho, Joshua's missing day when the sun stood still, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, the earthquake at the crucifixion, Paul and Silas in jail, and many, many more that I could mention. So by now, some of you may have concluded that I'm some wishy-washy liberal hell-bent upon denying the power of God's mighty intervention, but not so. Tonight, I want to talk about the miracles of Jesus, because I would argue that where a miracle has some naturalistic mechanism, it actually makes the true miracle more believable, not less. But there are numerous miracles which simply defy any scientific explanation. And so I'm going to talk today about a number of examples of such cases, the miracles of Jesus. I can just get the next slide. Yep. How many miracles did Jesus actually perform? Well, estimates vary from 34 to 45, described in some detail in the Gospels. It depends to some extent upon what you regard as a miracle. For example, does Jesus healing all 10 lepers count as one or 10? Mark and Luke base their Gospels upon other people's eyewitness accounts. Only Matthew and John were direct eyewitnesses of events. And of these, John's focus was more on who Jesus was. Matthew was the key eyewitness in which the narrative includes numerous asides. Some of these en passant incidents are listed here. Yeah, I don't need to read them all out. They're basically all of the same basic idea. Jesus saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And there are numerous examples of that. John, however, he does some of the similar kind of statements, such as 6:12, where he says he crosses the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. But then he sums it all up in John 21:25. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that not even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So we can say that there were about 40 miracles described in detail, he will take a few, and possibly hundreds of others. We have a huge number, uncounted number of miracles performed by Jesus, many of which were probably just simple, compassionate healings with no particular theological significance. But the miracles reported in the Gospels, mostly, if not all, seem to have been included for a particular purpose. Dozens of books have been written about Jesus' miracles, and we can't possibly cover all the material available. We will, however, examine a selection of these to make the point that there was more to these miracles than meets the superficial eye. And the first one we'll look at is the wedding at Cana. I don't know that I need to read all of this. I guess most of you are familiar with this narrative, but basically Jesus, his mother, and a handful of his early disciples were invited to a wedding where it says there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and they didn't know where it came from, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, but when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." All Christians, of course, are aware of the important symbolism of the Last Supper in the bread and the wine. So it comes as no surprise that water into wine and the loaves and fishes miracles features early on in Jesus's ministry. Indeed, the narrative begins with the words, "On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee." That mention of the 3rd day immediately reinforces a hint of messianic significance. Even before we examine the details, the wedding of Cana also brings to mind the many other wedding allegories in the Bible, such as the Song of Songs. And there are at least 5 wedding parables. And there's the imagery of the union of Christ with his bride, the church, symbolized in Revelations. We may note that Jesus was not trying to impress the wedding guests. This was a behind-the-scenes incident, witnessed only by the steward, Mary, and some of Jesus' disciples. Jesus was never going to convince everybody about his identity, but it was important that at least his disciples should know at the outset, although they took some time for the full reality to sink in, just who he was. In John 2:11, we read, "This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him." That's what was important. His disciples got it, at least to some extent. The purpose of this miracle was to underline who Jesus really was to the disciples, and perhaps surprisingly, to his mother, Mary. Some argue that there just happened to be 6 jars. Others point out that jars of water were for ceremonial washing of people and utensils. 6 is the number of incompleteness. The 6 jars of water were inadequate to wash away the people's sin under Jewish law, and that only the blood of Christ, symbolized by the wine, the best for the last, could justify us before God. Of course, none of this would have been obvious to the disciples at that time. Only with hindsight do we now see the contrast symbolized here between the old and the new covenants. Moreover, the extravagant superabundance, 200 gallons of fine wine, far more than was needed even for the most lavish wedding. This was far superior to what had gone before. So there's the wine symbolism, and then we go to the loaves and the fishes symbolism. There were 2 great multiplication miracles. The first was feeding of 5,000 men, presumably plus women and children, in Jewish Galilee, followed a little later by the feeding of 4,000 men. presumably with women and children, in mixed Jewish-Gentile decapolis. And they're described in Matthew 14, 15, Mark 6 and 8, and Luke 9. Jesus himself points out the meaning and the significance of all this in Mark 8, when he's talking about the baskets of food fragments. Evidently, the number of baskets of food was significant. 12 indicating the 12 tribes of Israel, followed by 7, the number of completeness, as bread was subsequently provided for the Gentiles. The bread itself was symbolic of the salvation brought by Jesus, also known as the bread of life. The latter is even signified by Jesus' birthplace, Bethlehem, in Hebrew, Beit Lehem, or in modern Arabic, Beit Laham, that is, house of bread or house of meat or nourishment, amounts to the same thing. This feeding of the two multitudes is both backwards and forward looking. The multiplication miracles recall Moses, representing the law, feeding the multitude with manna in the wilderness. It also reminds us of Elisha, representing the prophets, ordering a disciple to feed 100 men with just a few barley loaves. Here, Jesus physically shows that he is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Looking forwards, we now see that these two miracles are but a foreshadowing of the heavenly banquet to come. There may also be significance in Mark's passing reference to green grass in Mark 6:39. It was a short rainy season in that part of the world, and it implies that it was the month of Abib, the time of Passover, the time of hastily eating unleavened bread. Next, we come to 2 fishing trips. Get the next slide. Yeah. There are 2 great hauls of fish in the gospel, like bookends. One at the start of Jesus's ministry when he is gathering his disciples. Sorry, I'm trying to get the next slide up. There we are. Okay. So right at the start, Jesus is gathering together his disciples, and there's this great haul of fish. The other is the post-resurrection event at the close of Jesus's earthly ministry, described in John 21, 4 and onwards. Just to remind you, next slide, Jesus makes clear that his disciples were to be fishers of men. And in the closed room, when the risen Christ appeared to the disciples, Jesus reminded them that they were commissioned. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you, mentioned in the previous chapter of John 20. So why had the disciples reverted back to their old ways of fishing? And not only that, but fishing unsuccessfully. Jesus already had fish cooking on the beach. He didn't need the big haul of fish. Rather, this was a gracious reminder to the backsliding disciples that they had been tasked with a serious job of work to do, not in their own strength, but in the Lord's power. The point of these bookend fishing miracles is obvious. We are charged with making disciples, that is, with evangelism. Not the evangelism of big money-making arena scale events, not ego-stoking exercises of the vain, and certainly not American-style evangelism of right-wing politicized conspiracy theories, as we've recently seen. No, these miracles point to what the disciples were trained to do by Jesus, and by extension to what we are to do. That is, explaining the love of Christ, who he was and what he has done for us, something the Western Church has been singularly bad at doing. These New Testament passages also demonstrate that it's a tough assignment. which we are not expected to do, and indeed cannot do by ourselves. God turns up and does the hard, miraculous work for us, as illustrated in that second miraculous catch. There may be something more to the second fishing miracle. In John's Gospel, numbers are generally significant. So why, next slide, yeah. Why 153 fish? Don't bother counting them, they are indeed 153. Theologians have long speculated upon the significance or lack of significance of that number. Some say it means nothing, just a way of saying a large catch of fish. Others come up with quite far-fetched and tenuous numerological significance. Well, let me try this explanation on you. And I'm going out on a bit of a limb here. I could be wrong, but it seems to make sense to me. The Bible only mentions the number of 153 in one other place, back in 2 Chronicles 17, where it says, Solomon took a census of all the foreigners residing in Israel after the census his father David had taken. And they were found to be 153,600. Solomon's purpose was to assess the available number of conquered Canaanite artisans he could use to build the temple in Jerusalem. The Hebrew translation to 1,000 is highly dubious, but the number 153 is indisputable. We understand that the temple in Jerusalem was the Old Testament representation of God's presence and kingdom on earth. The Great Haul of Fish is a living New Testament parable of bringing people into God's kingdom. Just as the Old Testament reference is to building the symbolic Jewish representation of God's kingdom, that is, the cryptic reference was a nod to Gentiles also being involved in building God's new heavenly kingdom. Well, okay, maybe you buy that interpretation, maybe you don't. Either way, there is abundant scriptural evidence that our task, the business of present-day disciples, is not just to pray, your kingdom come, but to put that thought into practice. We are modern-day fishers of men. So we see a contrast in the symbolism of the 2 great hauls of fish. The first was directing the disciples at the start of Jesus's ministry to the Jews, and only the Jews. In Matthew 15, it says, he, Jesus, answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. But the second was after the Jewish leaders had rejected Jesus, and the ministry of drawing people into the kingdom was becoming global, that is, to Gentiles as well as to Jews, as alluded to numerically. The next one, walking on water. In Matthew 14, Mark 6, and John 6, we read about Jesus walking over the Sea of Galilee to the disciples' boat, whilst they were far from shore. According to recent bathymetry, this would have been over a depth of about 25 to 43 meters. It was actually much deeper in those days, maybe over 100 meters, because the lake has been slowly silting up these last 2,000 years. So there can be no rational explanation for walking on deep water. And that's the whole point. Jesus' walking on water was not a sign for everybody. It was reserved for the select few. He needed disciples who really understood who he was and not merely as a prophet. This miracle was immediately after feeding the 5,000. The disciples would have heard of former prophets doing this, such as Elijah and the woman's jar of flour and jug of oil in 1 Kings 17. The disciples would also have seen Jesus healing people, much as Elisha healed Naaman in 2 Kings 5, but still they didn't quite get who Jesus was. Others were more perceptive. The Magi recognized and worshipped Jesus. So did a leper who was healed. So did a synagogue ruler. But this was the first time that the disciples worshipped Jesus, recognizing him as the Son of God. Walking on water was the attention getter, but the deeper miracle was finally seeing and understanding who Jesus really is. Some have questioned why Jesus meant to pass them by, as stated in Mark 6. He was walking over the water and intended to pass them by, which sounds very odd in English because it is a Hebrew colloquial expression. Just as God revealed himself to Moses in a cleft in the rock on Mount Horeb in Exodus 33. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. In this context, the same expression, abari in Hebrew, has a connotation of revealing oneself, which again fits in with the meaning of Jesus revealing who he really was and is. The next example is the Geracin Demoniac. First, a few points of information. Nobody knows exactly where this incident took place, other than on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Gadara, now silted up by the river Yarmuk, is likely. I've been there and I can testify that the slopes down to the lake are all steep for good geological reasons. So, if I can use the cursor, anywhere along here could have been a likely spot for this incident to take place. Gadara is favourite, except that for the swine to fall down the slope there, wouldn't have fallen into the Sea of Galilee, they would have fallen into sedimentary land. Except that this whole sea has been silting up, as I said, for 2,000 years. And this river, the Yarmuk down here, has been eroding sediment from the Golan Heights and dumping it down in the valley here quite steadily for quite a long time. At the time that this incident took place, the Sea of Galilee was bigger. So this area around here to the south of the Sea of Galilee would in fact have been part of the lake. And so swine falling down from Gadara would indeed have fallen into the lake. Another point, several aspects of the narrative have a Roman connection. This area was certainly occupied by the Romans and was historically a focus of resistance against Roman occupation. The reference to legion is a Roman term. Swine or pigs were unclean, of course, according to Jewish law, and a herd of 2,000 was gigantic, unheard of and probably inaccurate. It may be, it has been suggested, that 2,000 is actually an allusion to a Roman battalion of 2,000 men rather than an accurate counting of the pigs. In Jewish thinking, all seas, Mediterranean or Galilee, were the abode of darkness, a place of dread and of godlessness, a view probably reinforced by the pagan seagoing cultures of the Philistines and Phoenicians, and also reinforced by the story of Jonah, which we discussed recently. What we see in healing the demoniac is Jesus' mastery of nature, also of human affairs and the spiritual realm. Most especially, the demons end up where they belong, unclean, cast out of human affairs, and in their proper domain of darkness. There may also be a symbolic slap in the face to Roman occupation, Romans also being regarded as unclean. In all respects, Jesus' authority is unprecedented and fully acknowledged by the demonic world. Notice that unlike other miracles in Jewish territory, where Jesus tried to keep the miracles known to only a select few, the healed demoniac was instructed to go and talk about his healing throughout the Decapolis. The Gentiles were not a threat to Jesus, whereas the priestly caste throughout Israel were increasingly hostile to him. This miracle is not just about one man's healing. It's about Jesus's ultimate authority to defeat, reorder, and overflow evil. Next, the withered fig tree. We have here a sort of sandwich structure in the narrative. It starts off the next day as they were leaving Bethany. Jesus was hungry, seeing in the distance a fig tree. He went to find out if it had any fruit, and he found nothing but leaves because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. And then the narrative is split, and then Jesus goes on to Jerusalem. Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers and preventing anyone from carrying merchandise through the temple courts. And then the narrative switches back to this business of the fig tree. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." At first glance, this seems to be unreasonable and churlish petulance on the part of Jesus, and not at all what one would expect of the sinless Messiah. But look more closely, particularly at the context and details. This incident is not just about what happened, it's also about where, when, and why. The structure of the narrative, as I said, is money changers sandwiched between two halves of the fig tree story, and not without reason. Both condemn the perverted religious system of the day. The symbolism of the figs feature prominently in the Bible, from the Garden of Eden to the high priest's clothing, through Isaiah, Micah, Zechariah, Joel, and elsewhere. It is the symbol of the sin of God's people being covered by God himself. This curse of Jesus isn't about a fig tree. It's what the fig tree symbolizes, namely the failed and thoroughly corrupt Jewish religious authorities. It's a fulfillment of the prophecy found in Jeremiah, chapter 8, verse 13. "I will take away their harvest, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine, there will be no figs on the tree, and their leaves will wither. What I have given them will be taken from them." Significantly, the fig tree in question was at the small village of Bethphage, between Jerusalem and Bethany. Bethphage, which translates as the house of unripe figs, was where the Sanhedrin, the religious Supreme Court, met to deliberate when they could not sit within the temple area. It was defined as the principal entrance to Jerusalem, and hence was officially part of Jerusalem, even though it was outside the city wall. It was especially where the secular matters were dealt with, and where executions were ordered, probably including the order for the execution of Jesus. You can see the geography in this little diagram here. It's walking distance between the walled city of Jerusalem and Bethany, and Bethphage is on the way. The Kidron Valley is up here. You have to go around the Mount of Olives through Bethphage, and it's a short distance to the temple. In cursing the fig tree, Jesus was abrogating the authority of the Sanhedrin, and through them, the entire hierarchy of the Jewish priesthood. Immediately after this, Jesus went to the temple where he declared, "I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation which brings forth the fruits of the kingdom." That's stated in Matthew 21. Arguably, there may be a further layer of significance. According to Jewish tradition, the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden was a fig tree. So Jesus may also have been symbolically cursing the origin of sin in the world. Whether or not this last point is correct, Jesus found that the fruits of righteousness, which he had a right to expect of his people, were absent. Hence his blessing passes from Jews to others. For the gospel writers, the fig tree incident and the parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard are essentially the same. The demise of those hostile to God is assured. Moving on to 3 examples of healing the blind. In the first case of healing the blind, given in Mark 8:22 to 26, it's a 2-stage affair, and it occurs at Bethsaida, just up here, which is just a little bit south of Caesarea Philippi, which is further north. And Jesus asks the blind man after the first stage, "Can you see anything?" And the man who's partially healed says, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Most of us are familiar with Jesus healing the blind man at Bethsaida. But why was it a 2-stage process? The narrative lacks purpose and clarity until we draw back and read on in the context of Mark's gospel. Peter was also from Bethsaida, and his understanding of Jesus' identity was also initially lacking. Immediately after the 2-stage healing, Jesus moved about 30 kilometers north to Caesarea Philippi, and here Jesus and Peter's discussion becomes the pivotal turning point in Mark's gospel. It's where Peter's spiritual blindness turns to enlightenment. Both the blind man and Peter were taken aside by Jesus. Both go through a 2-stage revelation regarding who Jesus really was, and both were cautioned to secrecy on that point. The 2 steps are clear. Knowing that Jesus can heal is one thing. The full revelation of Jesus as Messiah may require a further step. So then we go to the second of the healing of the blind, the case of blind Bartimaeus, which we read in Mark 10 and Matthew 20. The healing of blind Bartimaeus is not just another healing. It's a story of unexpected triumph because it takes place in, of all places, Jericho, that one-time bastion of pagan Canaanite religion, that former citadel of the false and hostile god Baal. Not only does Bartimaeus' faith allow Jesus to heal him completely, but his spiritual eyes are opened so that he abandons the trappings of his former life to immediately follow Jesus. The obvious truth is that the powerful love of Jesus can break through even in the most unlikely places. Well, that was Jericho down here. Then we move to the last one in up here, where we talk about the Pool of Salem in John 9. We might be thinking, ho-hum, yet another blind healing story. The blind beggar is told to go and wash in the Pool of Salem in Jerusalem. But the healing is almost incidental to what follows. It's a classic Hebrew chiasm in which 2 opposing themes are developed and contrasted. Just to clarify, a chiasm takes its name from the X-shaped Greek letter chi, and it's a 2-stranded narrative which contrasts opposing aspects. For example, in Esther, who rose from concubine to queen, and who was opposed by the powerful Haman, who ended up executed. two contrasting strands to the story. In this narrative, the first strand is the beggars, whose understanding is progressively refined until he eventually sees who Jesus really is. In the opposing strand, the bystanders and Pharisees become progressively hardened, resistant to the truth and spiritually blind. The players in the drama become polarized in their views, just as total blindness to Jesus's identity culminated in the crucifixion, and just as the world is now. Well, we won't look at any more detailed cases, but let's just take a step back and look at who else was healed. To take a rapid snapshot of who Jesus interacted with during his miracles and why they are so unexpected. The centurion's servant, a Roman, unclean, hated, and very probably homosexual. The Syrophoenician woman, her daughter, was healed, a Gentile. Lepers, legally and physically unclean, some of them Samaritans. Feeding of the 4,000, mainly Gentiles. The Geracin Demoniac, unclean, also a Gentile. Healing of the hemorrhagic woman, according to the law, unclean. Raising of the widow's son, also according to the law, dead and therefore unclean. Numerous other deaf, dumb, blind and ill people, all healed, all of them unclean. Isn't it striking that many, possibly most of the people Jesus healed, were those that a legalistic priest wouldn't touch or even go near? They are the social and religious outcasts. And they are outstanding examples of how God loves everybody. Chasing signs and wonders seems to be a pastime of some modern Christians. There are some who seem to be fixated upon chasing signs and wonders, whose faith seems to need the constant prop of miracles to bolster their confidence in the Lord. And this is nothing new. Recall how the scribes and Pharisees wanted a sign from Jesus, but Jesus responded by saying, "An evil and adulterous generation craves a sign. Yet no sign will be given it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah," which we read about in Luke and Matthew. Jesus cautioned against falsehood, including the superficialities of miracles. In Matthew 24, he said, "For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." So I emphasize again, the miracle may well be important in its own right, but of greater importance is whatever the miracle is pointing to, the theology behind the miracle. Jesus's miracles were essentially ways of seizing our attention in order to teach us something more profound, and that is what we should be seeking. Well, much more has been written on this subject. I can't possibly cover it all, but I recommend this book, which is by Jeffrey John, The Meaning and the Miracles. Very nice little book, which covers some of the issues I've been talking about in a bit more detail. And it's a good and interesting read if anyone wants to look into these things in a bit more detail. So that's all I have to say. Now is your opportunity to disagree. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon, for the presentation. And if I can actually find the chat line, I'll just start things up. Now, the first comment is by Bronwyn, I think. Does Mary's response in this text indicate that Jesus may have performed other miracles before the water wine miracle? If so, would this mean it would have occurred before his baptism? That's an interesting question. Do you want to speak to that at all, Bronwyn?
Yeah, just to clarify, I meant like Mary's, she recognised something in Christ as probably a mother would, but is it more than that? Did she actually see Jesus perform miracles before his baptism? Yeah, I was just curious. I just thought, that's something I hadn't really thought about before.
I think any mother who's confronted by an angel before the birth, more than a little bit curious and thinking something strange is going on here. But even though she knew something very special was happening, the way Jesus talked to her subsequently on several occasions shows that even she didn't get the full picture until the crucifixion, and then she got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you'd kind of expect that the baptism is Jesus' anointing, and so you'd expect that miracles probably were not either didn't occur or were not predominant prior to his baptism.
I suspect there were many miracles going on, but like the disciples, many people saw these wonderful things, but they didn't get the full impact. It needs the Holy Spirit to really illuminate what's actually going on. Otherwise, they just don't get it, as has happened all through history.
I've got a couple of nitpicking comments. First of all, on the Cana the incident occurring on the third day. If you go back into John 1, that was 3 days after his baptism. So first of all, he's baptized, and it says the next day he calls a couple of disciples. I think it was Andrew or whatever. And then Cana, it says that on the third day, so it's the third day after his baptism. So one could actually say, oh, the third day is coincidence, but it may actually, maybe, as you say, the term the third day does actually have significance in terms of.
When you look at 3 days, I mean, 3 days does occur quite a lot throughout the Bible, and in many cases you just can't tell whether that is just coincidental or whether that is an allusion to the 3 days before the resurrection, between crucifixion and resurrection. It's just left a little bit ambiguous, and I think a certain amount is left to us, to our own faith, to sort of fill in the dots, connect up the dots,
Yeah, could be put more unkindly and say speculate. Sorry. Yeah. Now you said you made a comment about the Western Church being bad at evangelism. Why would you say that?
I'm just thinking, well, I mean, we had this discussion a while back about the decline of the Western Church. And compared to the church in large parts of Asia and Africa and a few areas in Central and South America, compared to that, the traditional church in the West, the Americas, Europe, Australia, has had a dismal record of numbers going to church in decline. Number of Christians, people who declare themselves to be Christians, has declined terribly. Yeah, you actually look, even in Australia, you look at the historically how many Christians there were in society, and there was a time a few generations ago when it was nearly everyone. I'm thinking of some of the mines in there, some of the copper mines in the west of South Australia, and basically, if you wanted a job, you better turn up to church on a Sunday. You just don't get employed. No, obviously you can't do that now, but from the days when nearly everyone was Christian, we're now getting down to the smallish minority. And it's the same over most of Europe. We're in serious decline. And as we discussed a while back, there are many, many reasons for that. But one of the reasons is simply that we have not been taking seriously this idea that we are all here to be fishers of men, and we'd better well get on with it, because that's our prime directive from the Lord. And we haven't been doing that terribly efficiently. Well, there's some exceptions, of course, some marvelous exceptions, but overall, I think there's a lot to be desired.
With what you've said there, it's also interesting to note that in places like Africa and Asia, the gospel is relatively new. When the gospel was relatively new in the so-called West, it was also vigorous and doing well, but it has grown old, established, and then it's declined.
Yeah, and there's another interesting feature, is that if you look at parts of the world where the gospel hasn't been taught before, where Christianity is just starting up, that is very often, in fact, usually the place where you see extraordinary miracles happening. Yeah, I've been to parts of Africa now which were sort of animistic and Muslim up until quite recently, and there are some of the most amazing things going on there, which you just wouldn't credit in somewhere like Australia. And it seems to be the similar sort of story in parts of Central America, in parts of China, where the church is just starting up. That's where you usually see some of these extraordinary modern day miracles taking place.
It's a different stage, isn't it? Like the early, well, at the time of Christ, we had miracles, but I don't know of any miracles since, actually. So,
you mean here? Do you mean in Australia or generally?
Not recorded, not published the way they are in the Gospels.
I dispute that, June. There's a book by Craig Keener where he did his PhD on miracles, and he goes through historic, but he also considers recent times as well, and comes up with, what's that? Is that the book I'm referring to?
That's the book you're referring to.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Volumes.
And he's got a lot of stuff in the book which is documented, which can actually be checked out, which are miracles within our modern time. So, all right.
Yeah, and there are many more if you actually look for it. Like there's this one, Expecting Miracles: True Stories of God's Supernatural Power, by Heidi and Roland Baker. That's a well-known missionaries. Children and the Supernatural, and by Jennifer Toledo. Numerous books, if you actually look for them, where there are extraordinary things going on. And not only that, but this one, I actually went to Africa. I was working in Africa anyway, and I went out of my way to actually check up on some of these things to see if they were actually true. I actually went to an obscure part of Kenya to actually verify that some of these things took place. And it's absolutely true. I talked with people who were eyewitnesses to these things. I actually went to the locations where they'd taken place. Extraordinary things, totally verified. So yes, these things do happen for sure.
Yeah, but always now, as right back then, a person's faith in Christ cannot be built just on the occurrence of a miracle. It never worked back in Jesus' day. All those thousands of people that were fed by the multiplication of the loaves and everything, soon after that, they were able to just believe Jesus. And yeah, sure, they could acknowledge that there was a miracle, and they'd benefited from it. Possibly the same would apply to people who'd actually been physically healed, let alone, beyond being fed. They could receive that and then later on fall away, or just get on with life, or pressure of things gets to them and so on. So I don't think a person's faith right back then or even today can be based just upon the occurrence of a miracle or miracles. They were always meant to lead a person to Jesus, to elevate Jesus and what he said and what his mission was, who he was. And that's what people are called to have faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
Of course, then there was the resurrection of Lazarus. Obviously there were some people that were very moved by it, but then others went straight to the leaders and said, hey, this guy's just done something, but we've got to do something about him.
Yeah.
It had the opposite effect. Let's get rid of him.
Yeah.
One used the word signs. They were not proofs that make things happen. They were signs pointing in a certain direction. But so far as all those people falling away are concerned, I'm not sure that it's quite as significant as that. For example, Paul talks about 500 disciples seeing Jesus at one time after his resurrection. Plus, of course, there's the fact that so many became Christian so quickly after the day of Pentecost, or on and after the day of Pentecost. So they're obviously already primed, shall we say, to receive the gospel and repent.
Yeah.
Gordon, what do you make of the Thomas incident in, I think it's the Gospel of John, where he said he wouldn't believe unless he could put his hands in Jesus' side, etc. And then afterwards, there's a comment, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed.
Yeah, we're all supposed to exercise faith, but I actually have a sneaking admiration for Thomas, because I think along the similar sort of sides, similar ways to him. I'm a little bit skeptical until I actually see a bit of evidence. But like Thomas, once you see the evidence, you don't need to take any further action. You just believe. But yeah, I have a sneaking sense of I like Thomas.
Yeah, well, quite often that instance is taken as saying that faith is belief without evidence, which doesn't kind of gel with what we're on about. So,
I think the miracles basically are supposed to follow those that believe, and follow the gospel, basically. I've always found it interesting how John, when he was in prison, John the Baptist, and even after what he'd seen Christ do, or what he knew about him, he said to his own disciples, go and ask Jesus if he's the one. And then Jesus's response to him, and I've got it here, says, meanwhile, John heard in prison about the works of Christ, and he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who has come, or should we look for someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. So even Christ pointed to the miracles himself as evidence of who he was. But yeah.
Yeah, if in doubt, check out the evidence, and the evidence is there.
It's important, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one, Brian. I was going to bring that one up myself. And of course, Jesus, when he read from the scroll in the what was it, the synagogue, was it? From what did he read from again?
Isaiah. Yeah.
What was that scripture again? That at the end of it, I was trying to look it up, but I couldn't.
Something about good news to the poor.
But this something about this day has been fulfilled, or that was the ministry of Jesus, spiritually and physically.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just move on. This is from Brian. The story one.
To be in.
Yeah, could you speak to that, please, Brian?
Well, you mentioned that the story in John 1 was Jesus' baptism. I'm suggesting that it was not Jesus' baptism. Jesus came to John, was baptized, as recorded in the other Gospels, And also, as recorded in the other Gospels, he went off into the wilderness for 40 days, fasting and then tempting by the devil. And then he came back. And when he came back to where John was baptizing. And John said what he said to those disciples that was with him. And it went from there. And then as for the 3 days, it was roughly the journey from there by the Jordan back to Galilee. That was the 3rd day arrived back in Galilee because it was a long walk.
Yeah, you could well be right. And also you made another comment just subsequently about allegorizing.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying, Gordon, sounded in the direction of allegorizing what was there. Not that you were specifically denying the truth of what happened, but saying that the actual facts were less important than slightly allegorical interpretations thereof. And I didn't really feel that that's the best use of what's there in the Gospels.
I actually felt that a lot of what Gordon said was really good. I appreciated your talk, Gordon. And what you're saying is that with these events and the recording of them, there are a great many theological overtones, and I'd have to agree. And you've pointed out, or more than I've understood before, the significance of some of those. And a lot of them, there's just kind of just overtones without being quite specific, like this instance of the 3rd day, something or other. Why did John mention that? It's a bit vague, I know, but there's a lot of overtones with these things, and I think Gordon brought out some of that. I wouldn't call it allegorizing as such.
Well, I'm thinking of after the feeding of the 5,000 and then the feeding of the 4,000, then Jesus took his disciples aside and he pointed out all the sort of allegorized details, the numerical details, and he said, do you still not get it? It was clear that Jesus was thinking there's more to it than just the face value.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call that allegorizing. How do you mean Jesus was allegorizing those things?
And I'm not saying that it's all just allegorizing. It's yes, the miracle may be absolutely valuable in its own right. What I'm saying is that yes, but don't take your eyes off the fact that there may be a lot more to the miracle than what you see at face value.
Brian, what do you think is the best use?
Well, face value first up is the most important, I would suggest. Also, any particular meanings drawn out of it directly at the time. There's also the fact that what may have been the meaning at the time was not necessarily the meaning that the Gospel author tried to bring out of it, or what he was trying to bring across. Now, I'm trying to think of a good example to explain that particular point. I suppose the bit where John talks a lot about signs, he's saying this was a sign that Jesus did. It wasn't necessarily in the same sense meant that way when Jesus actually did it. So, for example, again talking about the water into wine at the wedding in Cana, Jesus didn't go there intending to do this sign. He was, to a certain extent, pushed into it by his mother. Nevertheless, it was a sign that others saw that pointed to who he was, that John was able to bring out later.
And hence, that's why it got written up in John's Gospel, whereas otherwise it would have just been one of numerous other miracles with no particular significance and probably would have been left out of the Gospel.
Like all the others that didn't get into all the books that weren't written.
Yeah, and I think that there is kind of the business of interpreting, whether you call it allegorizing or interpreting, does seem a little risky in a way, because a lot of it's a little speculative and ambiguous and kind of opens the door to doing whatever you like with it.
I must admit, when I was doing my master's degree, one of the things that I studied as part of all of that was the School of Alexandria, particularly under Oregon, which was very heavily allegorical in its interpretation in order to try and get around the skepticism of the Greeks, the learned Greeks in Alexandria. So therefore, I may be reacting a little bit contrary to that, having studied that.
Mm.
Okay.
My view is coloured by the fact that I once went to a Bible study, and the very first thing we did, I don't even remember what the Bible study was about, but on the table was a little note which read, "Think Hebrew." Think about what the people at that time would have understood, rather than what we see from the 21st century.
I think that's very important.
That's
Yeah.
a good idea.
All right, the next comment is a nitpicking, nasty comment from me. Is you use the things that did not have a rational explanation. I think what you meant was a naturalistic explanation, but it still may be rational to believe in a non-natural explanation.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
It's a question of semantics. I'm trying. I need a word to explain something that can't be explained by normal means, kind of thing.
Yes.
Whatever you want to call it.
All right.
So just going back to what you were saying before, Gordon, about when you went to Kenya and you carefully researched these events in that book to see if they really did happen. So obviously they were not naturally occurring events, and yet you were convinced rationally afterwards by your search for evidence that they did actually happen.
Yep. All right.
Yeah.
Now, Brian made a comment about chasing signs and wonders. Would you like to talk to that?
Yeah, you also mentioned at one point about people always chasing signs and wonders, and I quite agree. There are some people like that. They're always chasing the signs and wonders and never looking to what these signs are supposed to be pointing to. But there are also others who are always seeking to deny and reject signs and wonders. I'm suggesting both ideas are wrong.
Yeah, I made the subsequent comment that signs and miracles were also granted to Paul, and also from the examples that you raised, that they still do occur in modern times. Now, Bronwyn made a comment on signs and miracles. Would you like to talk to that?
Oh, I think we probably made it, but yeah, it was just the fact that, well, even in our Christian lives, I think we have own small miracles that might happen, in our own lives. But yeah, I think if you believe in Christ and his power, then it should be active in your life, and consequently, some miracles would happen. They don't have to be dramatic things. But that being said, if you're talking from a church point of view, there should be people in the church that sort of have that gift, or that the church itself should be seeing miracles as well. I think that's part of the reason why the Western church isn't growing like some of the Eastern churches, is the fact that we don't see it as much, as readily as they do.
Okay, thank you. We've come to the end of the chat comments, and so I'll open up just for spontaneous comments or questions. But just as an observation from those who've attended today, we've got a great representation from women. We've got Sandra and Elaine and Bronwyn and Wendy, because quite often,
thanks, girls.
Yeah. So quite often, apologetics seems to be the domain of old men. So now we just have to add the youngsters onto our list, and we'll be more well-rounded. So anyway, I open up to any questions or comments that just spring to mind.
I'd just like to respond a little bit more to Bronwyn. we tend to have this idea that there's kind of normality and then there are miracles, two completely different things, poles apart. It's not like that. There's a complete spectrum of God's interference, from mundane, trivial things where God does small little tinkering here and there, to the spectacular. It's a complete spectrum. It's not either or.
No.
The big event or nothing.
No, I agree. Yeah.
So I think we need to maybe have redefine what we mean by miracles sometimes.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I was taught, in my experience of the Christian evangelical church, that there is no need for miracles in this day, the present day, because since we had the canon of scriptures, that is sufficient in itself to feed the Christian, to help people come to Christ, and it doesn't need anything extra. As it says in Revelation, add to the Bible, it's sufficient historically, and the examples given and the books that are chosen to be presented as the Bible. So that's where I'm coming from there.
Okay, well,
and I've yet to go to a church where at the end of the sermon, the minister says, "Oh, and by the way, such and such was healed the other day," or the seas parted, or anything. That no one ever promotes the miracles, at least not in all the churches we've been to. So I'm just saying that it's, for me, and not for many Christians, apparently when you're a mature Christian, you don't need these signs and wonders. You need to study what has already been left for us. That's my understanding.
I think that's a very typical perspective from someone in America or Europe or Australia. But I absolutely don't subscribe to it, because there is no time in history when there have not been miracles. No time in the last 2,000 years. If you actually research it, you can find miracles happening all over the place, but they're not distributed equally. They're different. The church has different seasons, different times, different places. We could, if it weren't for COVID and I had lots of money, I could take you to places in Africa and introduce you to people who have seen miracles happening.
Yeah, look, hey, let June speak at this stage. June.
I'm just saying, I'm not denying that they're not occurring. Where Christianity is new, as someone else pointed out, it's a different stage. We have got the Bible, we've got the teaching, in Australia, America, and the old world or whatever. But in Asia and Africa, it's fairly new. And yes, there'll be miracles.
I don't know of anywhere in the Bible that supports the idea that the miracles will kind of be curtailed somewhere. I just don't see it. Whereas I do see plenty of places in the Bible which reinforces the idea that from now on there will be miracles, and that Christians will perform miracles. It's right throughout the Acts and subsequently.
Yeah, but I actually think a great deal of caution is warranted with regard to this whole subject of miracles and signs. I don't deny either that they do happen, but I think a great deal of caution is needed, because it does say in the Bible about the evil one who produces signs and wonders that are so incredible that they would deceive even the elect, if that were possible. It's not actually possible to deceive the elect, but they'll be so abundant and so outstanding, these supposed signs and miracles done by the evil one and through his hordes, as to deceive the whole world, and many people will be deceived. So that's a real warning to us to be very cautious about this whole subject. And, just because a person themselves has experienced a miracle, it might actually be a genuine miracle that they see as an answer to prayer, doesn't mean that what they then teach is to be just accepted. That's exactly what you shouldn't do, because you need to test the teaching itself as to whether it's from God or not, regardless of whether that person has had some wonderful sign happen to them or apparently through them to somebody else. It's not to deny that those things might happen or anything, but you've still got to test the teaching, whether the teaching is from God or not. And we do that all the time.
I'm 100% with you on that, Jeff. I think you absolutely, your faith is not dependent upon miracles. A miracle is there and it may reinforce your faith, but your faith is not dependent upon it. And if you do see a miracle, the first thing you have to do is test it to see, what is the theology behind it? Is this of God, or is it of something spurious? Yes.
You see this in the Old Testament too, where it talks about prophets, when a person claims to be a prophet. And if the first test was, does what the prophet say, in this case it is to do with predicting the future, does the prediction come true or not? That's the first sign. If it doesn't come true, it's a false prophet. But even if it does come true, if what the prophet prophesies comes true, you must still then test, is this prophet proclaiming it, leading you to the worship of the true God, or is he not? If he's doing this and leading you to Baal or Chemosh or countless other idols or some false version of God, a syncretistic view, then he is to be rejected, and not just rejected or ignored, but to be stoned and put to death back in their society.
Exactly.
Warning to us.
You're absolutely right. According to the law of Moses, the penalty for being a false prophet is death. No messing about there.
So the prophecy might have been a true prophecy because it came to pass, just like a miracle might actually be a real miracle in someone's life. But that doesn't mean that then the teaching that goes along with that should just be accepted carte blanche sort of thing, You've got to test it and weigh it up, and if necessary, reject it.
I do agree with all of that 100%. However, as kind of sounded like when you first started there, Jeff, and as a lot of other people seem to think, they're saying that because the devil can do miracles, we should throw out all miracles and not let God do miracles. Because there are false prophets, we should not allow real prophets. And that is the big mistake that a lot of people are falling into because of that side of things.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah,
we can't reject God because we're afraid of the devil.
Yeah, I agree.
And Moses' snakes ate up Pharaoh's snakes, so our miracles are better than theirs.
I'd say that in all my experience with apologetics, like you look at evidences for the existence of God, the resurrection, etc. That's good, but it's still not enough, as far as I'm concerned, because when I actually do have experiences of God in my life, then that kind of clinches it.
Yeah, it does.
And I'm kind of poor and needy. I need them often because I forget. And so, I do have experiences God through reading of Scripture. I'm impressed. I'm astounded by it. And so, I've had some answers to prayer, which were stunning.
Yeah.
And so, I actually need that ongoing experience to keep me going and keep me confident. But
I think most of us have experienced answer to prayer, and is that a miracle or is that not? I think it is a miracle in in a personal sense at least. Stunned everybody.
Was it me or you?
You had an answer to prayer, Kevin, about, was it something to do with your PhD?
Yes. That sprung to mind.
Yeah.
Whoops. That wasn't a miracle. That was my mug.
Might have been a sign.
Is it all done and dusted now?
Yeah.
And what's your interpretation of that sign, Jeffrey?
Your cup does not runneth over.
well, thank goodness the mug was empty.
Thank goodness.
It's a sign that we're all mortal.
Yeah.
What happened about your PhD, Kevin?
At one stage, I was supposed to be working on my PhD, and my supervisor was asking me to do other things to support the project rather than my PhD.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, and I didn't know where to stand, to whether to kind of, it's like Hamlet, to be or not to be, whether it's nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of trouble and by opposing in them. So, Sorry. So, should I, as a Christian, tolerate this intolerable situation, or should I actually take up arms against the sea of trouble? So I raised the issue at church on the Sunday and told them what a bind I was in, and so they prayed for me that I should have wisdom to know which course of action to take. So I rolled up to uni on the next day, Monday, 8 o'clock, and I was none the wiser. So I just, and I was pondering over my mind and said, so much for their prayers. And then, so I did nothing. I didn't go and see my supervisor. And then my supervisor rolled up at 9 o'clock. He said, Kevin, I've made a decision. I think you should work on your PhD. And so I went back to church on the following Sunday, and I had several people ask me what happened. And because one guy prayed for me, I said his prayer was absolutely hopeless and useless because I wasn't wiser. But God answered that prayer in a far more astounding way than I could have imagined.
Yeah.
No, great.
Mind you, if you understand my predicament now, I still haven't got my PhD because I had a problem with one of the examiners. But so you can actually pray for that, and your prayer probably answers in an entirely unexpected way.
Yeah.
How are we going?
Tired.
Is that a hint? Is it time for me to wind up?
I was going to say, I suppose, well, everyone has read the book, The Road Less Travelled.
No, I haven't.
No, I haven't either.
The Road Less Travelled. Sorry, I don't know the author. It's a beautiful book, and it's about the miracle of everyday life, the personal miracles that happen to you. The fact that you go off in a motor car and you actually come back safe that night.
Yeah.
How many times can you think, just for that split second, I would have been in history? Well, that happened to me today too. Just going from one lane to another, waiting for this codger to back into a parking lot. I almost nudged around him, and there was this huge lorry that went screaming past me, and it would have been history,
Yeah.
Little things happen, and he says in the book, just look out for them. You'll be surprised, So,
Yeah, my family had an example of something like that, probably a little bit more dramatic, because my nephew, about 20 years ago, he was 18 at the time, went out one morning for a jog, and they live at Flagstaff Hill, and the street that he was jogging on had houses on one side and bush on the other side, and it was like a slope. And anyway, there was a doctor who was home on furlough in this particular house that my nephew Andrew was going past, sort of jogging slowly, and he saw Andrew fall over on the pavement, and this doctor's area of expertise was heart massage, and my nephew had one of those heart attacks that you rarely have or rarely survive. About 5% of people who have them survive, and that's generally because they're around people that know what to do. And so basically for about 30 minutes, he gave him heart massage while screaming out for help. And eventually the ambulance got there and they used a defibrillator twice, and he came back. And he spent a couple of days in induced coma, and he had a defibrillator implanted into his chest, and now he's walking around. You wouldn't know any differently. But the doctor himself said that he'd just gone out for a coffee, and his window was one of those long-shaped windows. And he just happened to see him out of the corner of his eye as he came in. And if it hadn't been at that very second, he would have missed him because of the slope of the road. So,
Wow.
yeah, that was a miracle. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, yeah.
Well, I have a friend, his name is Hector Morrison, and he's actually principal of a Bible college in Scotland. He's been out to Australia several times, so I do know him personally and like him very much, not just because he's got a beautiful Scottish accent, but he really is a very godly person and teaches the word. But he also, back in Scotland, he was a regular runner, and what you've just described there sounds so similar to what happened to him. He used to run several kilometres just on his own and right out in Scottish countryside, and he collapsed running one day with some heart condition, and there just happened to be, unusually this day, a couple of people there. One of them was a German. It was a tourist. He was actually a tourist in Scotland, and he was a doctor. And right in that kind of field, and assisted Hector, our friend Hector, and gave him, the necessary first aid until someone could be called, like half an hour later or something like that. Got him to hospital, and he recovered from that. So in one sense, you could look at that and say, well, it was all sort of normal medicine and everything, but the coincidence of where it happened and when and the time, split second time, it was just amazing.
It is, yeah. So they happen.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder if this idea of having an angel on your shoulder could be almost literal, because I've had 5 or 6 experiences of very, very nearly being killed in different countries numerous times. And I should have been dead several times over, but just by seemingly extraordinary luck, I'm still here. So, it just sort of reinforces the idea that God's on my side.
Yeah.
Because we have the scripture, John 14:12. Truly I say to you, Jesus says, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he shall also do greater works than these. So,
yes.
it's a challenging thought, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is.
Okie dokie. If has anybody got anything they'd like to contribute now while it's still recording? Okay, well, I'll wind it up. So thank you very much, Gordon. This is the 3rd time I've heard this talk, because we've had dry runs. It got better every time. So well done. And it certainly stimulated a lot of useful conversation and contribution from others. So thank you very much. So at this point, we'll end the recording, but stay tuned if you would